Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Commercial Sex Trafficking, Using Research Findings to Support Investigations. My name is Allison Friedman, and I am with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat pod. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. During today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenter will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the Q&A pod as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org. where you can also view past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Nadia Ely for today's webinar from the National Criminal Justice Training Center at Fox Valley Technical College to begin today's event.
Thank you, Allison. As mentioned, my name is Nadia Ely, and I'm a project coordinator with the National Criminal Justice Training Center. The Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program has partnered with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center to host this webinar as part of our Amber Alert webinar series. In conjunction with Amber's mission, this series works together to bring together state, local, and tribal subject matter experts to present and discuss critical issues related to missing, abducted, and exploited children. To learn more about the Amber Alert program, our training and technical assistance opportunities, and to view past webinars, please visit the web link available on this slide. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce and turn today's presentation over to our presenter, Dominique Roe-Sepowitz.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dominique Roe-Sepowitz, and I am a social work associate professor in the School of Social Work at Arizona State University. I want to tell you just a little bit about my background. I'm a clinical social worker. I've developed a psychoeducation intervention that works with kids and adults who've been sex trafficked in our community. It's running in 10 organizations here. It's called STAR, Sex Trafficking Awareness and Recovery. We also are really active in our community as community organizers. We have developed a outreach program that happens every 6 months, a pop-up drop-in center called Phoenix First Step that I help coordinate with 20 other organizations for people who are prostituted and trafficked. I'm also helping to coordinate with the City of Phoenix a housing program for persons who've been trafficked using HUD vouchers. We are also researchers here in this office, the Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research. We evaluate programs, we work with local organizations, we partner with law enforcement, particularly Tucson, Phoenix, and Las Vegas Metro Police Departments. And we do large-scale research like what I will be presenting to you today. We're also innovators. We've created a school-based prevention program called Project Starfish.education, and that is for people working in schools to integrate it into their schools, including trainings. So that's a little bit of my background. I've been working in this field for about 13 years. And I'm going to tell you about the research that we are conducting on sex traffickers. This is the first of a series of 3 trainings. The second training will be about sex buyers, and the third training will be specific to American Indian and Alaska Native victims who we're researching and trying to find ways to creatively work with in our community. So what is a sex trafficker? These are the things that we're going to talk about during the next hour. What is the definition of a sex trafficker? Why are sex traffickers so difficult to research? What do we know about sex traffickers from this large, comprehensive national study on sex traffickers that we completed earlier this year? Human trafficking, I know this is repetitive. I read about some of what you're doing, and you're doing some incredible work, so this is repetitive for some of you, but I want to make sure that everyone knows that we are talking about sex traffickers who are under the definition of human trafficking, which includes forced labor, domestic servitude, and commercial sexual exploitation. And the TVPA in 2000 was our best initial definition of this. And it outlined who met the criteria for a victim of human trafficking. It also helped specialize sex traffickers as what their penalty should be and what that definition is. And there's a really good evolution of laws on the State Department website that sort of walks through how those evolved since 2000. It also talked about specific visas and services for foreign-born victims. So sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. A commercial sex act is defined as the exchange of sex for something of value, either given or received. And we're specifically going to talk about minors being sex trafficked today. So that includes what we've seen in our community, as I'm sure many of you have. That includes a place to stay, food, drugs, protection, clothing, jewelry, things that they want. So the exchange of something of value doesn't have a whole lot of things that are excluded from it, and included in that, especially during when a person is a minor, includes things that may have previously been defined as survival sex or sustenance sex. So if a person is under the age of 18, there is no, necessity for them to demonstrate the crimes that happened against them, but after they turn 18, they must be able to provide evidence of force, fraud, and coercion related to that sex act. This definition is helpful, hopefully, for those of you who have not read our study and are interested in understanding how we met the criteria of developing what we were looking for. So we were looking for sex traffickers who exploited a child in the United States and met the criteria of not being a sex buyer, but met the criteria of being a sex trafficker based on these laws. Waiting for the next slide to load. All right. So let's see. Sorry about that. Give me one more moment. Anyone on the line that can help me?
Sure, Dominique. Please tell me which slide you'd like to go to.
It is sex trafficker defined, the one that says a person who coerces or compels.
Sure, we'll get you back.
Thank you. So I'll start talking about it, and then it'll pop up for you. A sex trafficker is a person who coerces or compels another to exchange sex for something of value. It can include facilitating, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting. In our research, we are not including patronizing, although we do find that some of our sex traffickers initially recruit the victims that we work with by patronizing them, but we are not including those crimes in this study. We find that in our work that rarely is a sex trafficker only charged with sex trafficking, and sometimes they're not charged with that at all. They're charged with other crimes like kidnapping, assault, battery, domestic violence, but they are not charged with the sex trafficking crime, which is part of the challenge that we face when we're doing research on sex traffickers. And what we have found is there's no statute of limitations for federal charges of human trafficking, but we know that states have different rules, and some of the cases that we ran into were not prosecuted because the crimes were done before the statute of limitations expired for that case. So the challenges that we face when we research traffickers are that the vast majority of what we know about sex traffickers are from law enforcement data or interviews of convicted sex traffickers. So those are people who have been identified by law enforcement, have been convicted, and are then researchers reach out to them and ask them questions. Very few studies have been able to work with traffickers who have not been involved in the criminal justice system, and I think what we know is that really excludes a tremendous amount of people who are actively sex trafficking people or have sex trafficked people, and we aren't able to identify who they are and what they're doing and figure out how to intervene. The covert nature of sex trafficking is, of course, a huge challenge. We call it an invisible crime. It's a crime where the trafficker is rarely in the physical presence of the trafficking victim and the buyer. So they are if there's a sex act going on or there's a sting or something that happens, that the sex trafficker often isn't in the proximity, so they're by association, by physical association, are difficult to connect with, and people deny that there is one or a third party's involved. So that covert nature has been difficult. Also, the victims of sex trafficking are vulnerable, and we know that, and many of the reasons that they don't tell law enforcement or the community that is working with them about the sex trafficker is because they are, of the reasons that they're vulnerable, that they're using or that they're experiencing challenges that are overwhelming, and participating in a disclosure about a trafficker is a challenge to them. So the same vulnerabilities that make victims attractive to sex traffickers create challenges in building arrest cases, prosecution, and collecting enough data to understand this phenomenon. Many of our, Another incredibly important challenge is that many of the victims that we work with believe that their initial consent to participation in prostitution or exchanging sex for something of value, for 1 second, implies that their consent means that doesn't, they can't waive that later. So that initial consent is important in many ways as we work with victims of this trafficking. All right. Hey, Nadia, can people see the slides?
Yes, Dominique. The
good.
slides are advancing.
Okay, so this one I'm on is where does sex trafficking happen in the United States? It's simply not coming up on my screen. So we have two recent studies, one out of our office and one by Vanessa Boucher at Texas. And we found that sex trafficking cases of minors, which is the topic for today, were found in all states except for Alaska, Hawaii, West Virginia, and Wyoming. And we know that, that in those states there were human trafficking cases, but they may have not been considered human trafficking or charged with a human trafficking charge. So the cases that we're including today are just cases that are related to sex trafficking, and the charge was made that way. Vanessa Boucher studied human trafficking through organized crime, and she found human trafficking cases in all 50 states. Another reason that we didn't find them in some of those states was that we were only looking at the sex trafficking of minors, so something to consider. Next slide is the research highlights. Here are some other studies that we've done out of our Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research. The one I'm going to talk about today is the 6-year analysis of sex trafficking of minors, exploring characteristics and sex trafficking patterns. Another study we released this year in partnership with OJJDP and the Las Vegas Metro Police Department was a 1-year analysis of all their sex trafficking related cases from 2014. The reason we waited some time before we put together that report was that those cases were all closed by then, and that's a pretty interesting look at who are the sex traffickers, how are they recruiting victims, and it's much more detailed than this big 6-year analysis that we're going to look at. And the third report that we have recently completed was a study on some federal cases related to female pimps and the roles that females can fill in the sex trafficking of children. I found them to be quite interesting. So this study involved a couple of years of using a systematic search online to find sex trafficking and minor arrests in the United States. We found in all of the states, except for those I mentioned, 1,416 cases, and they were all related to the sex trafficking of a minor, but 3/4 of them only had a minor victim. So 1/4 of them had an adult victim, and that's important to consider as we move forward. The average age of the sex trafficker was 28 years old, but steadily got younger over time, and 71% of the sex traffickers were African American. So as you can see, some of this, I believe, is related to the use of the arrests and the knowledge of law enforcement that we're seeing a building over time of arrests and charging persons for sex trafficking crimes. So here starts in 2010. From 2010 to 2011, we had a 56%, from 2011 to 2012, we had a 56% increase in cases. We think that that's a really large push in the United States, including Amber Alert's assistance to train law enforcement around the country. There's been an increased of law changes during that time, and so we started to see this huge jump in cases and a steady increase since then. Just in between 2014 and 2015, the increase was 12%. So the next slide is the level of prosecution. So you'll see that there are different entities involved, and when we talk about how we've noticed over time that some of this has changed over time, but the vast majority of the cases, more than 50%, were at the federal level, and a number of them changed levels, of course, which we see quite often in trafficking cases. So for the 6-year analysis, only 1.2% of the sex traffickers were non-U.S. citizens. I think that's important to note as we talk about, we included in these cases anyone who was a foreign-born victim or were from who were related to a case that was not in the United States. The arrests just had to be in the United States, and only 1.2% of them were non-U.S. citizens. Almost 1 out of 5, so nearly 1 out of 5 was gang involved. 24% had a previous criminal record that included a violent crime. So as we speak with law enforcement and talk about when they are going to engage with a trafficker, what type of weapons should they expect? What type of activity should they expect? I think it's been very helpful to say that we've seen violent crimes in almost every study that we've conducted, that the sex trafficker has had a history of violent crime, of weapons, and so on, which we'll talk more about. 4% had a previous arrest for sex trafficking of a minor. Those were cases that were compromised for some reason. The minor victims were brought up to 17 states, so there was transportation, although of course that's not necessary in a human trafficking case like this, in sex trafficking, but they were brought around the country, and that was part of the ways that we noticed traffickers were impairing their victims from connecting with others, figuring out where they were, getting some control of the situation. The majority of the sex trafficking activities were in hotel rooms, so another participant in the trafficking of children is hotels, and I think we've worked quite hard as a country to talk about this, but I know in my community we continue to have hotels that look the other way and are not involved in our work. 67% of the cases use technology in the sex trafficking of children. The Backpage.com was in 41% of them. And the recruitment tactics by these sex traffickers focused on runaways with friendship, romance, giving a place to stay, and promising money or wealth. So for the runaways in our community, and these are national samples, that we know that a child who doesn't have a place to go, or doesn't have an ID, or doesn't know what they're going to do and where they're going to go, that they're incredibly vulnerable. And we found this over and over and over in these 1,400 cases, that it was sometimes it was a probation officer who knew that they were on runaway and made contact. Sometimes it was a person that they had gone to high school with a couple of years before, and both of them had dropped out. But they were very much targeted, and some of that targeting came from social media notifications that they're on the run, or saying things like, I'm really unhappy at home, and then promising of things. Many of the victims that we noticed in this study were looking for things of wealth, things that they wanted that other peers had, and these were promised by the traffickers. We did see that 1/4 of the traffickers were female. 55% of the females that were arrested, so 55% of that 1/4 identified in the documents that we were able to retrieve from online and in court records, and were identified as a bottom, which is the most trusted sex trafficked person by the sex trafficker, who may also be prostituted, may recruit victims, may develop rules and trainings, and may also give out punishment. So we wanted to really look at how sex traffickers behaved and how we can assist law enforcement in understanding that many times we see females involved and their past victimization is beginning to be considered. So the 6-year analysis, these are the professions that are that we were seeing with from the information that we were able to obtain. So we did have a number of the sex traffickers identified that were in authority. If they had child contact, that meant that they were a coach or someone in a school. The sex industry group, the 9 were bouncers at clubs or people who coordinated chat lines. Public figures, those were elected officials. 7 were law enforcement, 6 were military, 3 worked at the hotels, and 2 were direct school employees. So when we retrieved the information about how sex traffickers were finding their child victims, we identified that 15.7% reported that the victim had reported that they were provided with drugs or alcohol during the recruitment process, and then some of it to retain control. So to condition the victim during the recruitment, 18% also sexually assaulted them, and 19%, so 20%, almost 20% of them physically assaulted them. So we're seeing that kids are being given drugs and alcohol, that they're being sexually assaulted, and that they're being hurt and harmed as this recruitment happens. One of the perspectives is, how do you convince someone to do something? How do you do you love bomb them? Do you convince them that this is right? And one of the things that we continuously saw was that 1 out of every 5 had a very serious physical assault or sexual assault reported. Once the trafficking victim had the victim in their control, they used the following to control their behavior and retain them in that trafficking situation. So threat of harm of physical abuse, sexual violence, physical assault with a weapon, using drugs to control their minor victims, and threatening the victim with a firearm. We had have had a couple of cases in our community where our victims reported just being kept high and intoxicated for months at a time, that alcohol was the only thing provided by the trafficker, so they had very little choice to stay in control. So they were being given marijuana and alcohol every day, all the time, and that was part of the control. Some of the actions that we found by our sex traffickers in this study, this 1,416 sex traffickers, was that they would take the money when the prostitution activity was happening. They were part of the recruitment, so there were different actors and different functions within this, within these traffickers. Some of them just did transportation, others posted ads, others rented hotel rooms, took photography, sexual assault, physical assault, provided drugs, coordinated appointments, provided shelter, dictated prices. So what this slide really emphasizes is that there are multiple tasks that go into trafficking a person, and sometimes we had large groups that were involved in doing these things, and sometimes it was one person. But all of these pieces contributed to that sex trafficking experience of the victim. How were the sex trafficking cases identified? So when we received a notice of arrest and we dug into it a little bit more, we were able to find that most of the cases were reactive cases from law enforcement, that someone notified them to respond, someone notified them that this was happening. So it was either by the victim, which was the vast majority, the family of the victim, or an anonymous caller. And in 20% of the cases, they were identified through a police sting, which I know in my community we consider sort of luck that they were identified, not through a targeted sting, but to to sort of a more general sting. Where were the arrests in the United States for this for sex trafficker? The vast majority of the cases were in the bigger states, obviously California, Texas, Florida, New York. What we do know is that in those states that they have laws that are particularly focused on sex traffickers, as well as their law enforcement has significantly more training than some of the other states that had very few trafficking-related arrests and prosecutions. When we looked at these also, if you look at the big report, if you look at these by size, what you won't find is that they are proportionate. Rhode Island actually has the same proportion of traffickers that California does, so there's some interesting things about the statistics. You look at the transportation and movement of the traffickers. These are some of the paths and pathways that we saw that a victim was brought in to a bunch of different ways. And one of the things you'll see in the next slide is about how online ads were used. But we know that moving a victim, the sex trafficker has to find a product. They have a product, and they have to find someone to buy that product. And that online venue is really translatable. You just change the city by which you place that ad. So we were seeing kids move to multiple places during their trafficking, up to 17 states with the average of just over 2. So here are just some examples of some of that movement and what it might look like. And what we know is that if law enforcement gets wind of a victim, they're going to go look for him or her or they, but they may be looking at the second stop instead of the third stop, and they've already moved on. So here's the involvement of Backpage in the cases that were involved in this study. In 2015, there were 138 cases that had Backpage involvement. And as you can see, in 2010, Craigslist was still involved in trafficking. They still had their adult entertainment page, and you can see this huge kind of leap over time of involvement. So the victims, we can kind of look at some of these pieces that we had. The females were identified. There were 98% of the victims were female, with only 9 male and 1 transgender victim. And what we know from our research in our community is that simply where law enforcement in our community emphasizes the female pronoun and the female areas. We had a wonderful presenter here recently who talked about boys and boys who are trafficked. And to quote her, she said, if you're looking for a tomato, you go to the grocery store, but if you're looking for flowers, you go to a florist. And what we know is that girls in our community in the Phoenix area are simply trafficked in different places than males, and some of our transgender victims as well. So some of this really is slanted towards the female victim and the sort of the female paradigm of victimization for trafficking. The victim's age at exploitation ranged from 4 to 17, with an average of about 15. In my community, our research over time has shown about age 14.8, 14.9 as the average age of exploitation of a child. If it's an adult included, if we include all of the victims in our community, it's closer to 23. But 14.8, 14.9, and 15 seems to be an average age of what we're seeing sex traffickers sell in most of our major communities. The average age of the victim when their sex trafficker was arrested was 15.5. So they were victimized a little bit younger, and the duration ranged from they were rescued the day that they were trafficked to being involved for many, many years. 45% of the victims in these cases, these 1,416 cases, knew their sex trafficker. So it wasn't a stranger, it wasn't a new person that they had just met. Some of them had long relationships online where maybe they had Skyped or they had interacted. Some of them were parents of their friends. Some of them were their parents. Some of them were their coaches and people that they were involved in with persons of authority. More than half of the victims were runaways. So almost one out of every 5 cases had gang involvement, and that really led to the large number of people arrested in some of those big groups. I'm not going to try to say some of these gang names, but it was interesting to look at whether they were local or prison gangs, whether they were national gangs or international, and it was staggering how many international gangs were involved. We worked with our local law enforcement, and interestingly, they say at the state level, we are not seeing, we are not seeing a tremendous amount of sex trafficking with gang relationships at this point. And historically, we've seen sort of old gang members being involved, so people who've been out of the gang for a few years, who who are looking for their next career, or looking for something else to do, are then kind of really violent, terrifying sex traffickers in some of our communities. But they're not, the money's not going back to the gang. The gang is not the impetus. These simply are violent offenders who are finding that children are really sellable in their community. So what we found was the gang-involved victims were significantly younger than those who were involved when there wasn't a gang. So gang members are more likely to target younger victims. They're more likely to give their victims drugs and alcohol, and they're more likely to have a victim who is known to them in some way. So I'm on the 6-year analysis gang involvement slide. So gangs are, it was pretty interesting to see how savvy they were and how they were going for the most vulnerable victim in their work. So the next slide is the previous criminal history. And I think this is a slide that is due some attention. What we find is that when we do the criminal history checks on the persons that we analyze in our sex trafficking research, is that we find that they're often, almost always, many pages. And oftentimes we find that they start their criminal activity before they turn 18. So these are young persons who they themselves are oftentimes in some trouble, delinquency, or many of them have had cases where they were runaways, so they had missing person alerts out on them. And then they have just sort of an unbelievably stacked criminal history record that talks about hurting and being involved in the hurting of other people. So the things that we see that are incredibly telling are the domestic violence rates and these levels of violent crime and the use of weapons in their charges. What we want officials to know, so law enforcement and prosecutors, is that in this study alone, we had crimes involving weapons. 1 out of every 6 cases had a weapon involved, and that is different than if we look at it as this is 16%. 1 out of every 6. If you're going to identify a victim and try to find her trafficker, that to be prepared for the level of violence that victim has endured, as well as the level of danger that your law enforcement is putting themselves into as they go to apprehend that trafficker. I think those are pieces that many law enforcement maybe think about and talk about. Some areas people use SWAT teams to go in and arrest a trafficker, but others don't. And perhaps that's something to consider, that you have a pretty high rate that person has a weapon with them or has had a weapon with them in the past, and something to think about. 10% of the cases, 1 out of every 5, had a pimping charge in the past, and this really speaks to missed opportunities. And there are many reasons that cases that have previous sex trafficking charges against them didn't go through. So we're doing research with Las Vegas on this, and we know that other people around the country, good researchers, are doing this. And we're learning that, the vast majority of victims do not want to participate in the prosecution of their trafficker, that that participation really varies if they're a child or they're an adult. We found in our Las Vegas study that if a person is injured, they're more likely to ask for help as an adult, but as a child, that didn't seem to have an intervention of whether or not they were more likely to prosecute their traffickers. So in many of the cases that we've analyzed, there was no trafficker identified because the victim simply was not able to, willing to, wanting to, supported to prosecute or go after that prosecution. So we know that this previous history of pimping or sex trafficking of a child gives an indicator that this is a pattern of behavior for this trafficker, but we don't seem to be getting people, the sex trafficking cases, there were 6.8% of the ones that we were able to identify their criminal history. Those are some pretty interesting and important pieces for our work. So some of the things that we saw as we analyzed this data was that from the beginning, from 2010, And again, think about 2010. There were multiple venues online. There were different ways that people were bought and sold. And we were really having a big, strong push around the country to talk about human trafficking and sex trafficking. Laws were being changed. Shared Hope has done some great analysis of how laws evolve over time, and know that during this 5-year period, that was a very important time. So initially, we had 97 cases in 2010, and in 2015, we had 360. Something to consider in our data collection was that all of these cases were the sex trafficking of minors. They were people who were involved, who trafficked a minor. Not no cases were included just a buyer or a person who trafficked an adult. And we believe that we were able to capture all of this data because the media and local law enforcement and the people involved in disseminating this information, so maybe it was a federal report, that they thought that this was important enough. And we knew that if we looked for other aspects, maybe adult victims, that we wouldn't be able to really capture it all. And when we took a look at this and compared this to some of the State Department numbers, we found them to be really comparable. So we feel like, in defense of these numbers, which is a huge number, 1,416 is a huge cachet of documents, but we believe that we captured every single one that we could find that was documented, and we feel like this is a good picture of what this research looks like. So we saw over time a steady increase of the female sex trafficker involvement. So perhaps that was an increase in the awareness of the arresting officers or the prosecutors that the female role was not just as another victim. Could it be that we did see some female offenders, sex traffickers, that were working on their own? They were acting as an auntie. They were the mom of a trafficking victim. There were lots of roles that females played, but we certainly saw a pretty steady increase. We saw that the age of the sex trafficker dropped over time. So we're starting to see more peers in our research of a 16-year-old trafficking a 16-year-old. So the 16-year-old is a young female who's also being trafficked by a young female. So we're starting to document that. Perhaps in the past we wouldn't have charged them, or there wouldn't be public knowledge of that charge, is one perspective. But also I think people are starting to look at peers as potential traffickers as opposed to assuming that it must be an older adult who has that power. We saw gang involvement in the sex traffickers drop over time. That has many possibilities. It could be that initially we have heard in the community that people would say upon arrest, "Oh no, I'm not a gang member. I'm a pimp. I'm a trafficker." And I think there's been a shift in that work where people are less likely to say that they're a gang involved, and we know that to be true in all of our research on gang work. And that sex traffickers were increasingly likely to have a history of violent crime over time, so that they were more likely to have violent offenses, they're more likely to have weapons involved in their cases, that the dangerousness to our communities with the sex trafficker criminal histories increasing over time. So another Nadia, I moved to the 6-year analysis trends from 2010 to 2015 slide. The increases that we saw over time was that minors were more likely to be provided with shelter as a recruitment tool, so that our traffickers were increasingly targeting vulnerable victims who did not have a place to stay or were trying to find a new place to stay. That is something that we did not see as much in the beginning years, where it was, something that was a little more fun, more drugs, more things that victim wanted, but necessity became more and more prevalent in the work. And what we saw was that the charges were not were sustaining, even though they were providing a place to stay, not something that had like a cash exchange. And we really respect that in the prosecutors and the arrests by law enforcement, that they were opening their minds that that is something of value, that's a commercial sex exchange. So we were really happy to see that because the vulnerability of those victims is very clear. We also saw that sex traffickers were more likely to rent the room, the hotel room used in the sex trafficking activity. Some cases that we've seen in our community, the trafficker finds a buyer, and that buyer buys the hotel room for the day. In these cases, there were documented evidence that the sex trafficker was providing the room, that the room may or may not have been in their name or the bottom's name or someone else's name, but the sex trafficker was involved in that hotel. And I think this really emphasizes the importance of involving the hospitality and hotel industry, using that bedspread activity that they're doing in Minnesota so smartly, but how can we learn more, how can we involve hotel rooms and hotel industry to participate in this better. We also found that, hold on one second. So we found that sex traffickers became more specialized, and this is something that we've been trying to figure out in our research. Is are traffickers only going to focus on victims? Are they that are minors? Are they looking for victims and adults and minors? How does that work? And some of Meredith Dink's work has shown that in her interviews with convicted traffickers, that they knew that trafficking a child, that a minor was a problem. They knew what they were doing was going to get them into trouble, but they also acknowledged that those minor victims were much more likely to fall for their convincing, their manipulation. So we're finding that traffickers are continuing to exploit minors, and that rate of targeting minors is increasing. In the 1,299 cases that were prosecuted, the level of prosecution is increasingly more local, and we think that, again, goes back to the increased awareness, better and firmer and more appropriate city and state laws, county laws, and not so much dependence on the federal law, and that the skills of local prosecutors, law enforcement, victim advocates are really steadily increasing. So we went from 7% in 2010 of local prosecution of all the cases to 31% of the cases. And we saw the drop in federal prosecution from 86% to 48%. Go to the next slide. Summary, how are victims sold? So Nadia, I'm on summary, how are victims sold slide. So what we know is that in our research, we found that the traffickers used websites like Backpage. They can continue to buy and sell, traffickers can continue to do that on Backpage. Currently, you can use Bitcoin through MasterCard. And currently the adult industry escort ads that were on Backpage in that adult entertainment section is now in Women Seeking Men, and we saw migration of non-female persons who are being trafficked as well into other parts of the Backpage paradigm. So we haven't seen a decrease over time, but we did note that 41% of these cases had Backpage involvement, and we think that with some of the new legislation and some of the movement that's happening in our community to look at responsibility and look at their involvement, if 41% of the cases in a national study over 5 years involved one website, that we can say that involvement is incredibly important, and all of these victims were children. We saw our victims in these cases being trafficked through street prostitution, and there wasn't particular discrimination on how or what order were they going to put their victims on, online first and then street, or go through clubs. We have clients that in our community that we serve, as well as in this research, who are sometimes doing 3 or 4 things at a time, depending on the trafficker, their influence, their activity, their punishment, and so on. So the next slide is, how do sex traffickers work? And what we have found is that that there are many times where we have a single sex trafficker. He or she is trafficking their partner. He or she or they are trafficking their friend. They're homeless. They're in a street family. So we have seen sort of every dynamic, and we are not seeing that there is a unique perspective, that we're not seeing that only victims are trafficked by one style of activity. And we're really interested in looking at Vanessa Boucher's work recently on organized crime was really fascinating and important for us to read, because I think if we get lost in how people are trafficked and by what structure that is, I think it's really difficult to figure out that there are many, many ways that people are trafficked, and it's really difficult to put those things all together in one way. So we're working really hard to try to find ways that we can look at groups, we can look at how they interact as groups. Again, our work in Las Vegas indicates that that traffickers are working sometimes in small groups of former gang members, but the money that they're earning is not going quickly back to that gang in any sense. That they're just retrieving that money and they're moving forward. So we have found that. Hold on, sorry about that. We are. Oh yeah. So we. Oh no. Hang on a second. I'm having difficulties in my technology. So I am working with the slide that says how do sex workers work, and then the final slide is things to consider. So here are some things that we have learned that are maybe helpful for you, that we've learned in our research, that sex trafficking cases are intense, complex, and require a clear understanding of the dynamics of human trafficking. Our Las Vegas study helped us understand that there was an average of 28 days before a person was before law enforcement was able to arrest a trafficking victim, a trafficker. So we found that it was either the day that they were identified by the victim, but in many cases it took up to a year to find that trafficker. So the level of complexity of those cases has been a huge challenge for the community that we serve. So for victim advocates, it's been complicated and difficult. It's been complicated and difficult for law enforcement, but the complexity of it, and I think we are really critical of, especially our prosecution groups, that why aren't they taking this case? This has so many pieces to it, but knowing that they're intense, they're complex, the timeline, the willingness of the victim, or the capacity of a victim, or the humanity of the situation involves that we oftentimes don't have a prosecution of a trafficker, which is why we see them coming back into the system with a new arrest. We oftentimes see these sex trafficker cases having other types of crimes such as kidnapping, assault, and domestic violence. So these are not, we haven't been able to do specific research on determining if these are specialists, if sex traffickers are only sex traffickers. And I think those of you who work in this field will agree that that is very unlikely and probably not that important for us to learn. But what we do know is that there are parallel crimes that seem to build towards the sex trafficking. So it's a somewhat of a disregard for other people in their acts of violence, that their sexual assault of others. Many of our traffickers in this case had sexual assaults and sexual contact with children in the past. So what we know is that we have to sort of not get lost that these are just traffickers, that this is just a person who does this one thing, but there are many types of criminal behavior that person is involved in, and almost all of them are involving hurting and harming other people. What we don't know is, does that build up? Does that build to a place that then they feel like, I've done all these other things and now I can be a sex trafficker? How does that work? And we're really trying to figure some of those things out. Sex traffickers often have violent histories, including weapons, histories of child abuse and domestic violence. So how do we consider that as we interact with them? How do victim advocates recognize this when we interact with the victims, that they have been in a relationship or been in a situation with someone who has a high potential for being violent to them? And then once they engage with help and assistance in the community, that violent history doesn't go away, that they're still oftentimes really afraid of that trafficker and afraid of the situation. And finally, the cases are increasingly being prosecuted at a local level. that local law enforcement, local prosecutors, counties are becoming increasingly involved, and I think we're going to see an increase in successful cases. And we're working hard to make sure our community, with the support of OJJDP, Amber Alert, many really incredible social agencies, nonprofits are training local law enforcement to be able to identify the warning signs, but also looking for the traffickers. So we know that finding a person who's being trafficked, finding that victim is sort of step one. The second step is to provide them safety, but also to go after their trafficker and try to find that information. But again, because these are such intense, complex cases. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to pass this back to Nadia to moderate.
Thank you, Dominique. Our first question is there any data or interviews with traffickers that show that they too have been abused or trafficked themselves in youth?
So the answer is sort of yes and no. There have been some small studies done previous to Meredith Think, who did actually a quite large study where she interviewed traffickers. So prior to that, there were small studies where people looked at sex traffickers in their own history of child welfare involvement, juvenile delinquency, and found that those to be incredibly high. That these are persons who have been victims of crime themselves as children, as young adults, were involved in the system, oftentimes stayed in the system for a long period of time. And Meredith Think's interviews, so she interviewed a really large group, and Vanessa Boucher interviewed a much smaller group. But the follow-through on all of that is that, yes, these are oftentimes persons who have had incredibly difficult lives, which maybe is part of the way that they don't develop empathy, and that being a trafficker is sort of a skin that they can kind of climb into and become part of. I've seen cases where those past experiences were used as mitigating circumstances, and it is important to know, but it's a difficult paradox when we look at a former victim perpetrating on a new victim and creating victims. So I think that's something to consider. We don't have any programs that I know of in my community that looks at how to sort of rehabilitate the trafficker. We are working with some juvenile probation and adult probation entities to try to see if there are some consequences that can be put in their probation, maybe groups or therapeutic services that we can integrate into their reintegration into the community to make sure that they, pick a different way or are recovering from their own trauma. But we haven't seen any successful interventions, and there has certainly been no research on them that I'm aware of.
Thanks, Dominique. And in your own research, have you found sex traffickers who work within family structures, and what typically does that look like?
We have seen in this study, as well as others, that there are sex traffickers that work within family structures. We see persons like an uncle or a related person, a mom, an aunt, work within a structure. We have also seen vulnerable adult sex trafficking victims being convinced to sell their minor children to buyers. So we have seen it in a number of different ways. We have seen, although we haven't found them in sort of the typical sex trafficking language cases, we're seeing more of those cases being categorized as sexual abuse. That's the exchange with a neighbor for something. That is other families involved in the community sexually abusing that child for something of value, which would fall into the category of commercial sex exchange. So we are seeing them in some of our reports, but the majority that we know of in our community have been categorized as child sexual abuse cases and are still considered that way.
The next question is, what have you seen to be the most common mode of transportation of victims across state lines? Is it via airlines, ground, various forms of ground transportation? What have you seen?
So that's a great question. And recently in our community, our Department of Transportation has reached out to the Greyhound community here to do some training. And we have seen, we did see that transportation was by rental car, by bus, by airplane, that it was any mode. The majority of the transportation was in a rental car or on Greyhound. Many of our cases did not have, the trafficker did not have a vehicle, so they were also with the victim. Sometimes they had the victim take a different bus, so they weren't physically associated with them. We also saw traffickers sending bus tickets to their victim to run away and go to the bus station and get on a bus. So we saw tremendous involvement of kind of the lower, cheaper modes of transportation, rental car organizations, and some airplanes, some flights across the country, but far less than we saw buses and rental cars. And as you've seen in the news recently, we've had a number of people in Uber detect victims. So that also includes taxis and any type of sort of lower economic, sort of the things that are cheap to transport you from one place to another are the things that we detected in this study and in our other work.
Dominique, because your research is based on law enforcement arrest data and interviews, do you believe that profiling or stereotypes may have influenced the data available? And if so, how did your research account for that?
So we believe that all of the data on human trafficking is influenced by two things. One is the interest and awareness of the community. So we work I work in the Phoenix, Arizona, in a valley with many cities, and we have between 4 and 5 million people. And some of our cities have very, very strongly engaged community members and law enforcement and municipal leaders who believe that trafficking is a human rights violation and that we should actively act against it. And other people in the valley, other cities have really said, we'll look for the children who've been trafficked, or we'll focus on that, but we're really not willing to do a concerted effort here, because who might we arrest? Who might we get involved in, especially if we do things like demand reduction? So we see racial and gender biases in all of the work that we do, hosted by the philosophies and attitudes and beliefs of our community members and law enforcement. I do believe that we're really struggling with the rate of arrest of African American males as traffickers. And is it appropriate for us to say, well, those are biases that brought us to this place, or is it the systematic oppression that they've experienced? Were they incarcerated before? There's so many pieces that go into this. What we do know about our search was that it is driven by the arrests in the communities that filed those news reports and those criminal records. So I do believe that there are biases by sort of every single mean, and this is a snapshot of what we can see. This is an invisible crime, and are we looking at traffickers who are, we had one in the Phoenix area who was a white male radiologist who had a mansion up in Scottsdale. We are certainly not sort of always open to the idea that is a sex trafficker who meets the exact same criteria as the person that we see riding a bike behind a woman in one of our tracks here.
The next question is, bottoms are often considered low-hanging fruit. How often, based upon your research, are higher-ups in the trafficking organization or group arrested?
That question kind of breaks my heart. A bottom bitch, or a person who's at a high, the kind of equivalent to the pimp in the structure of a trafficking organization, is we talk extensively about the victim-centeredness of our work with people who would be considered bottoms, or a person who's been previously prostituted and trafficked themselves. I know that the community that I work in, we have multiple task forces. We're very engaged in this work, and they are less interested in arresting for prostitution and much more interested in looking for enterprises and the source. What we see repetitively is that our traffickers, if a person is picked up and it's a bottom, for example, he manipulates or she manipulates that person to recruit for them wherever they're incarcerated, that person continues to be a pawn in that scenario, and we're really concerned about that. And I know our community and in the research that we do, we really try to look at all the different roles that people play. So do we think that bottom has a different role than a person who set up the dates, like took the calls, or another person who maybe took the pictures and posted the ads on Backpage? And how do we really work through the history of victimization of a bottom and use that through a victim-centered lens has been really tough for our community. Many of our most active participants in our survivor community have self-identified as previous bottoms in enterprises, and really talked about what that felt like for them and the services that they needed, kind of not being categorized as a kind of simple, pure victim, that there were other things that they did that they need to sort of work through and deal with the trauma that kind of was given to them and put on them and they experienced, but also the things that they did to others. And we've really worked hard in some of our psychoeducation groups and the programs that we have in our community to make sure that we're not pretending that everyone has sort of the exact, this sort of simple, clean victimization, and being really aware that these criminal enterprises have many, many layers and that we have to pay attention to each person in it.
And earlier you addressed a question related to family structures. Has your data also found indications that youth in your community are being trafficked or recruited from foster or group homes? And typically, what does that look like?
So we had a case here not too long ago where a DCS worker called me and said, we have a kiddo in care whose school called and said they can't find her, but she gets home to the group home every single day by 3 o'clock. So the group home staff and the DCS worker have all been trained, part of our federal grant in our community, and both said, well, maybe we should look up her phone number. And so they put the phone number of that child into Google, and up popped a Backpage ad. And in the Backpage ad, it looked like it said available until 3 p.m. So what turned out to happen was that the girl would leave the group home and walk down the street towards the bus stop, and her trafficker would pick her up. But his keeping her in that group home sort of kept his access to her. He knew where she was. She was able to be under his control. She absolutely believed that he was good for her and that he was bringing good things into her life. And so that's just a kind of simple example of what we're seeing, but we are seeing that our victims in our community who are identified are disproportionately involved in child welfare, that the vulnerabilities that they demonstrate are very, that they overlap so significantly. We also see quite a bit of involvement in juvenile justice, and that those are things for loitering and petty thefts, but the trauma that we know that's involved in child welfare involvement absolutely creates vulnerabilities that these traffickers in this study exploited. We weren't able to find that data out from this study. We do have that information from our Las Vegas data if they were in foster care or child welfare in their state. So if you want to look at that document, you'll find it.
And the final question we have for today is, over half of the victims have been listed as a runaway or a missing person. Is there any additional data on that? And is there any data on if victims were currently reported as runaway or missing person at the time they were exploited?
So our study with Las Vegas, which is another study that I posted the link and that you have the handouts, we talk extensively about missing persons report. The media data and the court data we obtained for this study was really focused on the sex trafficker. We had very appropriately, we had very little data on the victim. The casework that we do, the case analysis that we've done in Las Vegas has been really telling that only 45% of the cases that we reported for that 1 year, there were 159 cases of sex trafficking in Las Vegas where they took a police report and that there was a victim identified. only 45% of the kids that were runaways had a missing persons report. So that meant 55% of them did not. And we have been working with NCMEC. NCMEC actually, Angela Offmuth came from NCMEC to Las Vegas to a presentation of that study. And how do we get systems to report? There is federal law that says child welfare workers must report their runaways as missing, but those same laws don't always apply to parents and caregivers or guardians who are perhaps not paying attention, or sometimes we've had victims in those cases in Las Vegas that this was their third runaway during the week, and maybe their first time they had filed a missing persons report. And then they got picked up, and then the second time, and then this was the third time, and they simply didn't bother to create another missing persons report. So we're seeing missing and exploited children resources being used in our community to identify sex trafficking victims, but what we're not able to do is figure out how to, without creating new laws and mandatory mandating families or parents or guardians to report their child missing. We're really struggling with how to address that.
Thank you, Dominique, for providing your insight and responding to the audience's questions. As I do not see any additional questions coming in, I think that we can close a little bit early, but before we do that, I want to remind our audience that this is part one of a three-part series, and encourage them to sign up for the webinar on September 19th, which is next week, in which you focus on your research as it relates to buyers, as well as the webinar on the 26th, in which you focus on Native victims. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Allison for the close of the presentation for today.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank Nadia and Dominique for a great discussion on this topic, and we just have a few brief reminders. The webinar will be archived on OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. And for more information, you can contact the National Criminal Justice Training Center at Fox Valley Technical College. You may also contact OJJDP or NTTAC via the Help Desk by following the contact information on the slide. And lastly, we would appreciate it if you could please take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
The host has left the meeting, so at this time, the meeting will come to an end. Thank you